In March 537 AD, according to contemporary Byzantine chronicles, 5,000 soldiers prepared to defend a city with 19 kilometers of walls against an army contemporary sources numbered at over 100,000 warriors. Historical records document what happened next as one of the most improbable defensive victories in military history. Think about those numbers. 5,000 defenders, 19 kilometers of fortifications. That's nearly 12 miles requiring constant manning. Contemporary historian Procopius, who witnessed these events firsthand, claimed the Gothic army numbered _0_, though modern historians estimate 30,000 to 50,000 combatants. Even at the lower estimate, that's a 6-to-1 disadvantage. At the higher estimate, 30-to-1, for over a year. By the end of this video, you'll understand how documented engineering innovations, psychological warfare, and tactical brilliance turned Rome's ancient walls into an impregnable fortress despite impossible odds. I'm about to reveal 3 verified facts that demonstrate why this defense succeeded. First, the revolutionary engineering solution, documented by Procopius, that neutralized the Gothic starvation strategy. Second, the artillery technology that contemporary accounts describe as making defenders nearly invulnerable. Third, the political betrayal, recorded in papal records, that nearly cost everything despite military success. But here's what makes this siege historically fascinating. How did a general commanding fewer than 5,000 troops successfully defend 19 kilometers of walls? What tactical innovation, described by eyewitness accounts, made Byzantine artillery so devastating that a single weapon could suppress an entire assault? Why did Gothic commanders, according to their own later testimony, agree to peace terms after holding every strategic advantage for over a year? How did cutting the city's water supply, a siege tactic that had broken countless cities, actually backfire against the besiegers themselves? And why did the Byzantine emperor, at the moment of his general's greatest triumph, grow suspicious of the very success he had ordered? To understand how Belisarius achieved the impossible, we need to step back to December 536 AD, when the Byzantine Empire was attempting something that hadn't been done in 60 years, reclaim Rome itself. In 527 AD, when Justinian I ascended the Byzantine throne, the Western Roman Empire had been dead for 51 years. He intended to resurrect it. You have to understand what Rome meant to a Byzantine emperor in the 6th century. This wasn't just another city. The Byzantines still called themselves the Roman Empire, spoke of their realm as the Imperium Romanum. But the western provinces, Italy, North Africa, Spain, had been lost to Germanic kingdoms for generations. To men like Justinian, these weren't independent nations. They were occupied Roman territory, and he meant to take it back. Justinian's grand strategy became known as Renovatio Imperii, the restoration of the empire. But it wasn't just imperial nostalgia. It was calculated ambition backed by military success. In 533, Justinian had dispatched his most talented general, Belisarius, to conquer the Vandal kingdom of North Africa. That campaign should have taken years. It took 9 months. Belisarius landed in Africa with 15,000 troops, 5,000 cavalry, 10,000 infantry, and a massive fleet. Within weeks, he'd shattered the Vandals at the battles of Ad Decimum and Tricomarum. By March 534, the Vandal king Gelimer had surrendered. North Africa, Sardinia, Corsica, and Tripolitania were Byzantine again. The speed of the conquest stunned the medieval world. Contemporary chronicles record that Belisarius was granted a triumph in Constantinople. parading through the streets with Vandal treasure and the captured king himself. The African success proved something critical. Rapid reconquest was possible. Small, professional Byzantine forces could defeat larger Germanic armies through superior tactics, discipline, and generalship. Justinian's dream seemed achievable. Then, Italy provided an opportunity. The Ostrogothic kingdom, which had controlled the peninsula since 476, descended into chaos after the death of its founder, Theodoric the Great, in 526. His daughter, Queen Amalasuntha, served as regent but was murdered by her cousin Theodahad in 535. The murder gave Justinian exactly what he needed: legal justification for war. He could claim to be avenging a queen, restoring order, protecting Roman citizens living under Gothic rule. But beyond legal pretexts, Italy represented the ultimate prize. Whoever held Rome held the symbolic heart of empire itself. Control of the peninsula meant control of the central Mediterranean. For Justinian, reconquering Italy wasn't just strategic, it was existential. His legitimacy as Roman emperor depended on actually controlling Rome. For this impossible task, Justinian had the perfect weapon: a general who'd already proven he could conquer kingdoms with handfuls of soldiers. But Flavius Belisarius's path to Rome would be paved with both triumph and tragedy. Flavius Belisarius. History remembers him as Byzantium's greatest general, but around the year 500, he was born to Thracian peasants in a frontier village, where survival, not glory, defined success. The historian Edward Gibbon described him as having been an origin emphasized by many historians to contrast with his later achievements. His native language was Thracian, his second language Latin, rare in the Greek-speaking East. This linguistic oddity may have created an early bond with Justinian, who also came from the Latin-speaking Balkans. As a young man, Belisarius joined the imperial guard under Emperor Justin I, Justinian's uncle. Something about him impressed his superiors, because he rose quickly through the ranks. But his early military career was anything but glorious. At the Battle of Thanuris in 528, Byzantine forces suffered defeat, though Belisarius's exact role remains unclear. At Minduos, possibly his first independent command, he lost again. These weren't the victories of legend. They were lessons bought in blood. Then came Dara in 530. Belisarius commanded 25,000 Byzantine troops against 50,000 Sassanid Persians, a 2-to-1 disadvantage. Military logic suggested retreat. Instead, Belisarius used defensive trenches, fortifications, and superior cavalry coordination to achieve a stunning victory. Contemporary accounts record it as one of the rare Byzantine triumphs against Persia's professional armies. His tactical genius had announced itself. But genius alone doesn't guarantee success. The following year at Callinicum, Belisarius faced the Persians again, this time with numerical advantage. He lost catastrophically. Historians analyzing the battle note his tactical errors. He observed from ground level, limiting his visibility. He created no reserve forces. He positioned his army poorly. When the Persians concentrated and broke through his line, he had no way to plug the gap. Byzantine casualties were heavy. Belisarius himself fled before the battle concluded. He was recalled to Constantinople and charged with incompetence. After investigation, the charges were cleared, but the defeat taught him something crucial. He never again observed battles from ground level. He never again failed to create reserves. Unlike many generals who blame others for defeat, Belisarius learned from his mistakes. In January 532, he had a chance to redeem himself in the most brutal way imaginable. Constantinople erupted in the Nika riots, a week-long explosion of rage against Justinian's policies. The Blues and Greens, normally rival chariot racing factions, united in revolt, chanting quote 2, which means victory. They proclaimed a new emperor, Hypatius, nephew of a former ruler. Justinian nearly fled the capital. Only Empress Theodora's fierce speech convinced him to stay and fight. Belisarius, alongside General Mundus and the eunuch Narses, received orders that admitted no hesitation: crush the revolt by any means necessary. They trapped the rioters in the hippodrome, blocked all exits, and unleashed their soldiers. Contemporary sources report between 20,000 and 50,000 civilians were massacred in the confined space. The killing lasted hours. When silence finally fell, Hypatius was executed, and Justinian's throne was secured in blood. The Nika riots revealed Belisarius's absolute loyalty. He would follow orders even when they meant slaughtering thousands of his own people. That loyalty, cemented through massacre, made him invaluable to Justinian. Around this time, Belisarius married Antonina, a widow who happened to be an old friend of Empress Theodora. That connection provided him with a direct line to the imperial court, critical for securing reinforcements and funding. Procopius, in his secret history, portrayed Antonina as manipulative, a scorpion hiding her venom. But during campaigns, she proved instrumental in managing logistics, organizing grain transport, and maintaining the domestic stability that allowed Belisarius to focus on warfare. Fresh from saving Justinian's throne, Belisarius was given his great opportunity: Africa. The 9-month conquest of the Vandal kingdom established his reputation. He didn't just win battles. He won them with far fewer troops than conventional wisdom required. In 535, he turned toward Italy. Sicily fell with minimal resistance. Then came Naples in 536. The city's walls seemed impregnable, but after a 20-day siege, an Isaurian soldier discovered an entrance through a disused aqueduct. Byzantine forces infiltrated and sacked the city. Contemporary accounts describe the brutality as a deliberate message: resist and face annihilation. The sack of Naples terrified the Goths. Their king, Theodahad, had failed to send aid during the siege. Gothic nobility, enraged by his incompetence, deposed and murdered him. They elected Vitiges, a veteran warrior, as their new king. While Vitiges consolidated power in the north, Belisarius marched toward Rome. By December 536, Belisarius had conquered Sicily, sacked Naples, and was approaching the Eternal City. He'd proven he could shatter kingdoms with handfuls of troops. But he'd never faced what awaited him: defending 12 miles of ancient walls with 5,000 men against a Gothic army that would darken the horizon. While Belisarius marched north in triumph, the Goths were electing a king who would stake everything on reclaiming Rome. The Goths had a problem. Their king was a coward, and Naples' smoldering ruins proved the price of cowardice. Theodahad had failed to defend Naples during its 20-day siege. When the city fell, Belisarius' forces had made examples of the defenders. Gothic nobles gathered in council, their decision unanimous: Theodahad must die. As the deposed king fled Rome toward the Gothic capital of Ravenna, an agent of his successor murdered him on the road. Medieval chronicles record it as both execution and necessity. The Gothic council elected Vitiges in autumn 536. He was not of the royal Amal dynasty. He had no claim through blood. But he was a veteran of Theodoric the Great's campaigns, a seasoned commander who understood warfare. In a kingdom facing invasion, military competence mattered more than lineage. Vitiges faced an immediate legitimacy problem. Gothic nobles might follow a warrior, but they preferred royal blood. His solution was political brilliance. He married Matasuntha, granddaughter of Theodoric the Great and daughter of the murdered queen Amalasuntha. The wedding in 536 was celebrated with a panegyric delivered by Cassiodorus, the Praetorian prefect, which survives in historical records. The oration cast the Gothic dynasty in Roman terms, emphasizing continuity and legitimacy. Through marriage, Vitiges claimed royal authority, but he couldn't claim Rome itself. Not yet. You have to understand the Gothic perspective. From their viewpoint, Theodahad's failure to defend Naples had doomed that garrison to massacre. The same would happen to any force trapped in Rome against Belisarius. Rome's walls stretched 19 kilometers, impossible to defend adequately with a small garrison. Vitiges made the strategic decision that seemed most sound. Abandon Rome temporarily, mass all Gothic forces at Ravenna, then retake the city with overwhelming strength. He left a 4,000-man garrison to hold Rome. On December 9th, 536, as Belisarius approached the Asinarian Gate in the south, panic seized the Gothic defenders. Procopius records that the garrison, witnessing Byzantine entry through the southern gate, fled through the Flaminian Gate, quote 4, abandoning Rome without firing an arrow. The citizens, terrified of suffering Naples's fate, had already sent a delegation to Belisarius promising support. After 60 years of Gothic rule, Rome was Roman again. It fell without a fight. Vitiges spent the winter of 536 to 537 consolidating the Gothic response. At Ravenna, he assembled a national levy. Gothic custom required all fighting men to serve when the kingdom faced existential threat. He stripped garrisons from across Italy, pulling every available warrior north. He gathered siege equipment, constructed massive siege towers, prepared supply trains. The army he assembled was enormous by medieval standards. Procopius would claim not less than 150,000 warriors, a figure modern historians consider exaggerated. Contemporary scholar J.B. Berry called it propagandistic inflation designed to glorify Belisarius's later defense. Historian Leif Peterson estimates the actual combat strength at 25,000 to 30,000 warriors, with Procopius's higher number perhaps including non-combatants, camp followers, and Gothic forces across all territories. Even at the conservative estimate, Vitiges commanded at least 30,000 fighting men. His plan was methodical. March south with overwhelming force, surround Rome, cut the aqueducts, and starve the Byzantines into submission. Standard siege warfare. The Goths had time, numbers, and supply lines from their own territory. Belisarius had ancient walls and 5,000 soldiers. By February 537, Vitiges had assembled what would become a Gothic national army. Every fighting man from an entire kingdom marching south toward Rome. Inside the ancient walls, Belisarius had 5,000 soldiers. The stage was set for the impossible. But Belisarius hadn't spent the winter idle. While Vitiges gathered his army, the Byzantine general was turning Rome into a death trap. December 536. Belisarius stood on the Aurelian walls and confronted a mathematical nightmare. 19 kilometers of fortifications. 5,000 men. If he placed soldiers evenly along the towers, each man would need to patrol roughly 260 meters. If he positioned them shoulder to shoulder, they'd stand less than 4 meters apart, far too dispersed to defend against concentrated assault. The Aurelian walls had protected Rome since the 3rd century. Built between 271 and 275 AD by Emperor Aurelian as emergency defenses against Germanic raids, they remained formidable despite centuries of weathering. The brick-faced concrete construction stood between 8 and 16 meters high in different sectors, thickened in the 4th century to resist siege engines. 383 square towers punctuated the circuit, spaced roughly 30 meters apart, each designed to provide flanking fire against attackers. 16 primary gates controlled access to the city. But the walls had been neglected under decades of Gothic rule. Belisarius ordered immediate repairs. Teams of workers dug a deep, wide ditch around the entire exterior perimeter. The fossa, as Romans called it, served dual purposes: preventing siege engines from approaching the walls and making mining operations nearly impossible. The merlons atop the battlements were modified to provide additional protection for defenders. Several vulnerable gates were narrowed with masonry. The Flaminian Gate, identified as the weakest point, was completely blocked with brick and stone. The mausoleum of Hadrian received special attention. This massive circular structure, built as a tomb for the emperor in the 2nd century, dominated the western approach to the city. Belisarius converted it into a fortified bridgehead, protecting the Aelian bridge over the Tiber. The towering height and commanding position made it critical to defending the western sectors. Grain arrived in massive quantities from Sicily, transported by the Byzantine navy that controlled Mediterranean supply routes. Storage facilities throughout the city were filled to capacity. The civilian population was organized into work crews for wall maintenance and emergency repairs. Belisarius established his headquarters on the Pincian Hill in the northern sector, which offered commanding views of the most likely Gothic approach routes. Then came the weapons that would define the siege. Belisarius deployed ballistae along the walls, iron-framed bolt shooters powered by torsion springs made of twisted sinew. These machines, refined over centuries of Roman engineering, could launch heavy bolts up to 460 meters, with enough force to pierce through a tree trunk or the thickest Gothic armor. Procopius describes them as capable of targeting individual soldiers at extreme range. Scorpios, smaller and more precise versions of the ballista, were positioned for what contemporary accounts call precision shooting. A single ballista could suppress an entire scaling party before they reached the ditch. The psychological effect alone was devastating. Defenders could kill attackers from distances where retaliation was impossible. Here's what military historians still study. Belisarius didn't try to defend every meter equally. He identified weak points, fortified them specifically, and maintained mobile reserves for rapid response. The Bucellari, his elite household cavalry, would serve as that rapid response force, able to reinforce any threatened sector within minutes. The sound of hammers on stone echoed across Rome as workers completed the modifications. By late February 537, the defenses were as ready as 5,000 men could make them. The grain stores were full. The artillery was positioned and calibrated. The weak gates were sealed. Belisarius had done everything tactical genius could achieve. It wouldn't be enough, not for what was marching toward Rome from the north. On the first day of March 537, Gothic scouts appeared on the horizon. 3 days later, Belisarius would face his first test and nearly die in the attempt. Belisarius had fortified the Salarian bridge over the Anio River with a tower and a garrison. The bridge, located north of Rome on the approach from Ravenna, was critical terrain. Control it, and you could delay any Gothic advance for days, buying time to prepare further defenses. Lose it, and the enemy gained direct access to Rome's northern gates. The garrison panicked. When Gothic vanguard forces appeared in overwhelming numbers, the Byzantine soldiers abandoned their fortifications and fled into the city. No one bothered to inform Belisarius that the bridge had fallen. On the morning after, the general rode out with 1,000 of his bucellari to reconnoiter the area. These were his best troops, elite household cavalry sworn personally to him, equipped with both composite bows and lances. They were among the finest warriors in the Byzantine Empire. But on this morning, their excellence wouldn't matter. They were riding into an ambush. Belisarius discovered the Goths already in possession of the fortified bridge. Before he could withdraw, Gothic cavalry charged from concealed positions. What followed nearly ended the siege before it began. Contemporary chronicles record specific details that historians still debate. Belisarius rode a distinctive horse. Sources call it Phalios, a dark mount with a white blaze on its face. Gothic deserters who joined Vitiges' forces recognized the animal and shouted to their comrades to concentrate fire on _quote_7_. They knew that killing the Byzantine commander would shatter enemy morale and possibly end the campaign. The bucellari formed a fighting withdrawal. But the Goths pressed hard. Belisarius fought in the front ranks. Accounts describe him personally killing several Gothic warriors in close combat. His bodyguards struggled to protect him as Gothic spears targeted the distinctive horse. The fighting was desperate, the casualties mounting. Then the Salarian Gate came into view. The Byzantine garrison, hearing the sounds of combat, had opened the gate to receive their general. Belisarius and his surviving bucellari broke through the Gothic encirclement and made it inside the walls. The gates slammed shut behind them. Historical records document that Belisarius's escort had suffered heavy casualties in the brief engagement. The near disaster revealed several truths. First, Gothic cavalry could match Byzantine troops in close combat. Second, Belisarius's aggressive reconnaissance style put him at personal risk. Third, the enemy could concentrate force at specific points faster than he'd anticipated. And fourth, communication failures could prove fatal. The garrison's flight from the bridge without warning had nearly cost him his life. But it also demonstrated something the Goths needed to see: Byzantine discipline and fighting quality. Even ambushed and outnumbered, the bucellari had fought their way clear, protecting their general, and reached safety without breaking. That kind of cohesion would prove crucial in the months ahead. The skirmish at the Salarian Bridge was just a prelude. The next day, February 2nd, 537, the real siege began. The Gothic army arrived like a migration of nations. Contemporary accounts describe the horizon darkening with warriors, supply trains, and siege equipment stretching for miles. Rome was too large for the Goths to completely encircle with the forces available. Vitiges established 7 camps around the city: 6 east of the Tiber River, 1 on the western bank near the Vatican on the Campus Neronis. This disposition left the southern gates intermittently accessible, a gap Belisarius would exploit. The camps overlooked the main gates and primary approach roads. From these positions, Gothic forces could intercept supply convoys, prevent sorties, and launch coordinated assaults. But the sheer size of Rome's perimeter meant the blockade leaked. Byzantine scouts could slip out through the southern sectors, and small supply boats could reach the city via the Tiber. Vitiges' first strategic move targeted Rome's lifeline: water. The Goths cut all 11 aqueducts feeding the city. These massive stone channels had supplied Rome for centuries, carrying millions of gallons daily from the surrounding hills. Their destruction had consequences beyond simple thirst. The aqueducts powered the water mills on the Janiculum Hill that ground Rome's grain into flour. Without flowing water, the mills stopped. Without mills, grain couldn't be turned into bread. Vitiges had calculated that even with full granaries, Rome would starve within weeks once milling ceased. It was sound strategy. Cutting aqueducts had broken countless sieges throughout history. But the destruction also ended the ancient Roman habit of public bathing, a cultural blow that marked the end of classical life in the city. More critically for the Goths, stagnant water from the cut aqueducts began pooling in the marshes around their camps. Within weeks, those pools would breed the mosquitoes that carried malaria. For the moment, though, the Goths held every advantage. They controlled the countryside, commanded the supply routes from their own territory, outnumbered the defenders by at least 6-1, and had severed the city's water supply. Military logic suggested Rome would fall within a month. What Vitiges didn't know was that Belisarius had already solved the water crisis with an engineering innovation that would revolutionize siege warfare. Faced with the prospect of starvation through lack of milling capacity, Belisarius implemented a solution that contemporary chronicles called inventive genius. While the aqueducts were dry, the Tiber River still flowed through Rome, its currents strong and constant. Belisarius ordered 2 rows of boats to be moored in the river, likely near the Aurelian Bridge where the channel narrowed and the current flowed fastest. Between these boats, workers suspended water wheels connected to millstones. The natural flow of the Tiber powered the wheels, allowing the city to grind grain into flour as long as the river flowed. Rome could sustain itself indefinitely. To protect these vital mills from Gothic sabotage, heavy iron chains were stretched across the river upstream. The chains prevented the Goths from floating logs, debris, or even corpses downstream to clog or damage the mechanisms. Byzantine guards patrolled the riverbanks constantly, ensuring the mills remained operational. The floating mills neutralized Vitiges' primary strategic assumption. The siege would not be measured in weeks. It would be measured in months, perhaps years. As long as grain could reach the city and the Tiber flowed, Rome could hold. But the Goths still had numbers, siege equipment, and determination. If they couldn't starve the defenders out, they would break through by force. Before unleashing assault, Vitiges attempted negotiation. In late February 537, he sent his commander Vassis to the Salarian Gate with an offer for the Roman population. The speech, preserved by Procopius, was carefully crafted. The Goths had ruled Italy justly for 60 years. They offered the Romans peace, protection, and continued prosperity if they would only reject Byzantine rule and return to Gothic authority. The citizens of Rome, assembled at the walls to hear the offer, decisively rejected it. They remembered Naples. They remembered the brutal sack that followed resistance. But they also feared that supporting the Goths might bring Byzantine retribution later. More importantly, they believed Belisarius could actually defend them. His African conquest, his victories over the Persians, his demonstrated tactical genius, all suggested that backing the Byzantine commander was the safer bet. Contemporary records indicate that Pope Silverius and eminent Roman citizens had already thrown their support behind Belisarius. The church bells of Rome would ring for Byzantine victory, not Gothic return. Vatius returned to Vitiges with failure. Diplomacy was exhausted. The time for blood had arrived. 18 days into the siege, Vitiges unleashed his most significant assault. His engineers had constructed 4 massive wooden siege towers on wheels, drawn by teams of oxen. These structures towered over the walls, designed to bring Gothic warriors directly onto the battlements where they could overwhelm the thin line of defenders. Accompanying the towers came scaling ladders and battering rams, a full complement of siege equipment for a coordinated assault against Rome's northern walls near the Salarian Gate. As the towers began their ponderous advance across the open ground, the Roman population watching from within the city struck with consternation. Procopius records that many citizens had never seen siege warfare before and feared these machines represented unstoppable force. Panic began to spread. Belisarius began to laugh. His soldiers, seeing their commander's reaction, hesitated. The general ordered them to remain quiet and hold their fire until he gave the signal. The reason for his outburst remained unclear to the defenders. As the Gothic siege towers approached the ditch, Belisarius had dug around the walls. Their purpose became evident. When the towers reached effective range, Belisarius drew his bow and personally shot 3 Gothic cavalrymen in rapid succession. The soldiers on the walls, taking this as an omen of victory, began shouting in celebration. Then Belisarius revealed his tactical insight. He ordered his archers to concentrate fire not on the Gothic warriors, but on the unarmored oxen pulling the massive towers. The animals were dispatched quickly. Without their biological engines, the 4 towers stood immobilized in the field, useless wooden monuments to failed assault. The Goths had thoughtlessly brought the oxen within bow-shot distance from the walls. Byzantine arrows cut them down before they could even deliver their cargo. The tactical principle was devastatingly simple. Siege equipment requires draft animals. Draft animals are vulnerable to missiles. Position artillery to target the animals, and the most sophisticated siege machinery becomes immobile junk. But Vitiges had prepared a multi-pronged assault. While the towers advanced on the northern walls, Gothic forces attacked the vivarium on a different sector, a structure used for housing wild animals, which had lower defensive walls. The Goths managed to break through the outer wall, creating a breach that threatened to turn the entire defensive line. Belisarius reacted instantly. He led a detachment of his Bucellari directly to the threatened sector, launching a counter-sortie from the gate that took the Goths by surprise. Byzantine cavalry crashed into the Gothic assault force from an unexpected angle, disrupting their attack formation. In the chaos, Belisarius's troops set fire to the Gothic siege equipment positioned at the breach. The Day 18 assault collapsed across multiple sectors. The immobilized towers stood abandoned in the field. The vivarium breach was cleared and rapidly sealed. Gothic casualties mounted as Byzantine defenders, their confidence soaring from witnessing their general's tactical mastery, pressed advantages at every point. Contemporary chronicles describe this day as the turning point in Gothic morale. They had brought their best equipment, planned a coordinated assault, and been defeated by a commander who seemed to anticipate every move. The psychological impact was profound. If massive siege towers couldn't breach Rome's walls, what could? The Goths pulled back to their camps to reconsider their strategy. But Vitiges wasn't finished. He would try different tactics, different sectors, different approaches. The siege was just beginning. On the western bank of the Tiber, the Goths launched an assault against the mausoleum of Hadrian and the nearby Cornelian Gate. This sector seemed vulnerable. The fortifications were older, the defenders fewer, and the mausoleum itself, while imposing, was a monument, not a purpose-built fortress. Gothic infantry advanced using scaling ladders, their approach covered by a testudo formation. Shields locked overhead to create a protective shell against missile fire. Roman doctrine called this the underscore, quote, underscore 8 underscore, and it had protected advancing soldiers since ancient times. The formation should have allowed Gothic troops to reach the base of the walls relatively safely. The Byzantine defenders on the mausoleum fired arrows and javelins, but these proved largely ineffective against the overlapping shields. As Gothic ladders began rising against the walls, the situation grew desperate. The defenders were running low on conventional ammunition. In an act of cultural desperation that underscores the intensity of the siege, the Roman soldiers on the mausoleum began breaking apart the colossal Greek marble statues that adorned the structure. These were priceless works of art, centuries old, depicting gods, emperors, and mythological scenes. The defenders shattered them and hurled the massive fragments down upon the Gothic assault. The weight of solid marble proved devastating. The heavy pieces smashed through Gothic shields and helmets, crushing warriors beneath them. The testudo formation, designed to deflect arrows and light projectiles, couldn't withstand tons of falling stone. The formation broke. Gothic soldiers scattered, abandoning their scaling ladders, fleeing the marble rain. The assault on the mausoleum failed. The bridgehead held. But the cultural cost was permanent. Irreplaceable artworks destroyed in moments of military necessity. Later historians would lament the loss of classical sculpture. But for the defenders in 537, survival mattered more than preservation. The Gothic attacks continued to probe different sectors, different approaches, searching for weakness. They found none. Everywhere they struck, Byzantine discipline, artillery, and tactical flexibility repelled them. As direct assaults failed, the siege settled into a war of attrition. Both sides suffered, but in different ways. The Goths controlled the surrounding territory, but their camps became death traps. The stagnant water from the cut aqueducts bred mosquitoes. Malaria spread through the Gothic forces. Disease and famine began their terrible work. The Gothic army, assembled from across Italy, consumed enormous quantities of food daily. As the siege dragged into summer, the surrounding countryside was stripped bare. Supply lines from Gothic territory in the north grew longer and more vulnerable to Byzantine raids. Meanwhile, the Byzantines held the advantage of interior lines and controlled access to the Tiber. Small boats could navigate downstream from secure ports, delivering grain to the city. The southern gates, left unblockaded due to the Goths' insufficient numbers, allowed limited resupply. The floating mills continued grinding grain into flour. Rome was uncomfortable, crowded, and tense, but not starving. Belisarius maintained aggressive defense. He launched frequent cavalry sorties from the gates, harassing Gothic camps, burning supply wagons, and inflicting casualties. Byzantine horse archers proved devastatingly effective in these raids. They would approach Gothic positions at a gallop, rain arrows on the defenders, and retreat before Gothic heavy cavalry could close for melee combat. The Goths, lacking effective ranged cavalry to counter this tactic, they suffered constant attrition. Procopius emphasizes in his account that this tactical superiority was a major reason for Byzantine success. The Goths had no way of retaliating effectively against mobile archery. Their convex shields and heavy armor protected them in close combat, but they couldn't force the engagement. Byzantine horse archers would strike, retreat, strike again, never allowing decisive contact. The psychological toll on the Gothic army was immense. They held numerical superiority, controlled the countryside, and possessed the offensive initiative. Yet they couldn't break through. Every assault ended in failure. Every day brought more disease, more hunger, more casualties from Byzantine raids. Morale deteriorated, By late 537, the Gothic position had become untenable. Disease ravaged the camps. Supplies dwindled. The army that had marched south, confident of quick victory, had been bleeding for months against walls they couldn't breach and defenders they couldn't break. Vitiges faced a choice: continue a siege that was destroying his army, or negotiate terms that would preserve what remained of Gothic power in Italy. In March 537, amid the siege's violence, political intrigue erupted within Rome itself. Pope Silverius, who had initially supported Belisarius's entry into the city, was accused of conspiring to open the Asinarian Gate to Gothic forces. The charge was treason. Historians note that this accusation likely originated not from genuine conspiracy, but from Empress Theodora's theological agenda. Theodora wanted Vigilius, a deacon more sympathetic to her theological views, on the papal throne. She needed Silverius removed, and the siege provided convenient cover. The scene of deposition, recorded in the Liber Pontificalis, was deliberately theatrical. Silverius was summoned to Belisarius's headquarters on the Pincian Hill. When he arrived, he found Antonina, Belisarius's wife, seated on a couch while the general stood at her feet, a reversal of normal protocol that emphasized her authority in this matter. Antonina confronted Silverius directly. "What have we done to you, Lord Pope Silverius, that you should want to betray us into the hands of the Goths?" The Pope protested his innocence, but his protests were ignored. He was stripped of his papal vestments, dressed in the robes of a monk, and sent into exile. Vigilius was installed as the new pope, exactly as Theodora had desired. The episode demonstrated Belisarius's absolute authority over both military and civilian spheres within Rome. He could depose the Pope himself on questionable evidence and install a replacement without significant resistance. It also revealed Antonina's influence. She, not Belisarius, conducted the confrontation, suggesting her direct connection to Theodora gave her authority even over her husband in political matters. The deposition would have long-term consequences for church-state relations, but in the immediate crisis of the siege, it passed with minimal disruption. Rome had larger concerns than papal succession. The Goths were still at the gates. By late 537, both sides were exhausted. The Goths, suffering from disease, famine, and the breakdown of supply lines, requested an armistice to send envoys to Constantinople for peace negotiations with Emperor Justinian. Belisarius agreed to a 3-month truce. But the Byzantine general had no intention of actually pausing operations. He used the armistice for strategic preparation, not rest. During the truce, Belisarius brought 3,000 Isaurian infantry and massive quantities of grain safely into Rome through the now unguarded routes. The reinforcements nearly doubled his effective garrison strength. Meanwhile, he sent his general John with 2,000 horsemen into Pixenum, a region in central Italy, with orders to capture Gothic strongholds and plunder the countryside, essentially turning the siege around by threatening the Gothic heartland near Ravenna. The Gothic embassy did travel to Constantinople, offering territorial concessions. They proposed ceding Sicily and southern Italy, territories already in Byzantine hands, in exchange for a Roman withdrawal from central Italy. The dialogue, as preserved by Procopius, clearly illustrates the reversed situation. The Gothic envoys claimed to have suffered injustice and offered to surrender lands they'd already lost. Belisarius, secure in his position and strengthened by reinforcements, was dismissive of their proposals. When the Goths offered to negotiate over Campania and Naples, Belisarius responded with biting sarcasm. Quote 10. The message was clear. The Byzantines would accept nothing less than complete Gothic surrender. When Vitiges realized the truce had been a cover for Byzantine expansion rather than genuine peace negotiations, he attempted several final acts of desperation. Gothic agents tried to drug the guards and infiltrate through the Aqua Virgo aqueduct. Every attempt was thwarted by Belisarius's rigorous security measures and network of informants. The armistice expired with the Gothic position worse than before. Their army was diminished by disease and desertion. Byzantine forces had captured territory in Picenum, threatening Ravenna itself. John's cavalry raids had demonstrated that the Goths couldn't even protect their own heartland while committed to the siege of Rome. Vitiges faced strategic catastrophe. His capital was threatened. His army was dying in camps around Rome. And the city he'd besieged for over a year showed no signs of surrender. In March 538, exactly 1 year and 9 days after the siege began, Vitiges ordered his troops to burn their camps and retreat to the north. The fall of Ariminum, modern Rimini, to John's cavalry force had created an immediate threat to Ravenna. Vitiges' family remained in the Gothic capital, and he couldn't risk its capture while his army bled uselessly outside Rome. As the Goths began their withdrawal, crossing the Milvian Bridge over the Tiber, Belisarius saw his opportunity for a final, devastating blow. He waited until roughly half the Gothic army had crossed the bridge, dividing their forces. Then he ordered a full sortie, Byzantine cavalry and infantry pouring from the gates to attack the remaining Goths on the western bank. The assault caught the retreating army in chaos. Those who'd already crossed couldn't return to help their comrades. The bridge was jammed with soldiers, wagons, and equipment. Those still on the western bank were caught between Byzantine attackers and the river. Panic spread through Gothic ranks. In the confusion, many Goths were pushed into the Tiber and drowned, weighed down by armor and weapons. Others were cut down by Byzantine cavalry as they fled. The organized retreat became a rout. The killing continued for hours as Belisarius's forces pursued the fleeing enemy. When the final Gothic survivors limped into Ravenna, they brought news of catastrophic defeat. The siege of Rome had cost the Ostrogothic kingdom dearly. Contemporary estimates suggest the Goths lost approximately 30,000 men during the campaign, killed in assaults, dead from disease, casualties of Byzantine sorties, and drowned or slaughtered during the final retreat. Byzantine casualties for the entire year-long siege remained under 100 killed. The successful defense of Rome was a tactical masterpiece. A garrison of 5,000, reinforced to perhaps 8,000 during the armistice, had held 19 kilometers of walls against a force that had outnumbered them by at least 6-1 for over a year. They'd repelled every assault, maintained supply lines, engineered solutions to strategic challenges, and ended the siege by inflicting crushing casualties on the retreating enemy. But the long-term impact on Italy itself was tragic. The siege of Rome was over, but the city that Belisarius saved was a shadow of its former self. The destruction of the aqueducts and the repeated sieges over the next 2 decades would reduce Rome from a metropolis that once housed hundreds of thousands to a town of perhaps 30,000 inhabitants. The public baths, a defining feature of Roman civilization for centuries, never reopened. Without flowing water from the aqueducts, the grand bathing complexes became empty monuments to a lost age. The cultural transformation was profound. Daily bathing, which had been central to Roman social life, simply ended. The Gothic War would continue for another 16 years after the siege ended. Vitiges was captured when Ravenna fell to Belisarius in May 540. Taken to Constantinople in chains, the Gothic king was allowed honorable retirement before dying in 542. But Gothic resistance didn't end with his capture. Under the capable leadership of their new king Totila, the Goths managed to reverse the situation until the empire's position in Italy nearly collapsed. Rome would be besieged again by Totila in 546, and this time Belisarius was unable to prevent its fall. The city was reoccupied by Byzantine forces soon after, only to be besieged yet again in 549. The constant warfare devastated the Italian peninsula. Cities were sacked, populations enslaved or killed, agricultural production destroyed. The economic and demographic damage was catastrophic. Italy would not recover its pre-war population levels for generations. Belisarius continued to serve Justinian with varying degrees of favor and suspicion. His popularity among both his soldiers and defeated enemies had aroused the emperor's jealousy. After the capture of Ravenna, when the Goths offered to make Belisarius emperor of the West, he refused. But the offer itself damaged his relationship with Justinian permanently. The emperor feared that his most successful general might become too powerful, too independent. Belisarius was recalled to Constantinople, sent back to Italy with inadequate forces, recalled again, dispatched to face the Persians, and generally treated with the suspicion that capable subordinates often receive from insecure rulers. Despite his absolute loyalty, proven through the Nika riots and every campaign afterward, he never fully regained Justinian's complete trust. The irony was stark. Belisarius had achieved everything Justinian demanded. He'd conquered Africa in 9 months. He'd defended Rome for over a year against impossible odds. He'd captured Ravenna and the Gothic king. Yet his very success made him dangerous in the emperor's eyes. In 562, near the end of his life, Belisarius was accused of corruption and briefly imprisoned. Though later pardoned and restored to honor, he died in March 565, just months before Justinian himself. The legend that he ended his days as a blind beggar is fiction, but it captures a truth about his fate: absolute loyalty to an emperor who rewarded success with suspicion. The survival of Rome in 537 wasn't the result of a single factor, but of synchronized defensive doctrine that exploited every available advantage. First, asymmetric technology. The Byzantine reliance on composite bows and torsion artillery allowed them to engage Gothic forces from positions of relative safety. The Day 18 failure of the siege towers proved that massed Gothic infantry was useless against a commander who targeted the biological engines of siege warfare. Belisarius understood that oxen, not towers, were the vulnerable point. Second, topographical resilience. Belisarius treated the Aurelian walls as a living system rather than a static barrier. He repaired, modified, and integrated existing structures like the Mausoleum of Hadrian to create multi-layered defense. The ditch he dug around the entire perimeter prevented close approach of siege equipment. The blocking of weak gates eliminated vulnerabilities. Third, logistical innovation. The floating mills on the Tiber neutralized the Goths' primary strategy of starvation through water severance. This engineering feat alone likely extended the siege by months, allowing reinforcements to arrive and Gothic morale to deteriorate. Without the mills, Rome would have run out of bread within weeks, despite full granaries. Fourth, information dominance. Through constant patrolling, rotating guard duties, and a network of spies and informants, Belisarius maintained internal security. He identified and neutralized both external sabotage attempts, like the Aqua Virgo plot, and internal treachery before they could manifest. Even the deposition of Pope Silverius, while politically motivated, demonstrated his control over potential fifth columns. Fifth, psychological warfare. By engaging in high-risk skirmishes and maintaining a visible, confident presence on the walls, Belisarius ensured that his 5,000 defenders felt they were part of a superior force. Meanwhile, the Goths felt they were fighting a ghost-like enemy that could strike from any gate at any time, inflicting casualties without accepting decisive battle. The tactical lessons from this siege influenced medieval warfare for centuries. The importance of artillery in defense, the vulnerability of siege equipment to ranged fire, the psychological impact of aggressive sorties even when outnumbered, the critical role of logistics in extended sieges, the value of interior lines and fortified positions. Military theorists studied Belisarius's defense of Rome as a masterclass in how to win when victory seems mathematically impossible. Belisarius is often called the, quote, 12, a title that captures both admiration and melancholy. He represented the final flowering of classical Roman military tradition, combining the discipline and engineering of ancient Rome with Byzantine tactical innovations. After him, warfare in the Mediterranean would be forever changed. The defense of Rome demonstrated that the collapse of empires is often delayed not by the size of armies, but by the ingenuity of those who command them. Belisarius never had the resources he needed. He was always outnumbered, always undersupplied, always operating with forces smaller than military doctrine recommended. Yet, he won. His career also revealed the fatal flaw that would eventually destroy the Byzantine Empire: internal jealousy defeating external victory. The pattern established at Rome would repeat through Byzantine history. Generals achieving impossible victories only to be destroyed by court intrigue. The empire that could coordinate Vikings, Greeks, and Lombards into perfect military harmony couldn't coordinate its own leadership. The Gothic War, despite its initial successes, is often viewed as a Pyrrhic victory. It drained Byzantine resources that might have been employed against more serious threats in the east. While Justinian's generals fought in Italy, Slavs and other peoples raided the Balkans with relative impunity. The plague of Justinian in 541, which killed up to a quarter of the empire's population, sapped manpower and tax revenues needed to complete the Italian campaign swiftly. Some modern historians argue that the resources spent conquering Italy would have been better invested in defending the empire's existing borders. Others counter that no ruler could have anticipated the plague, and Justinian's strategic vision of reunifying the Mediterranean under Roman authority was sound given the information available. What's certain is that the siege of Rome in 537 to 538 remains one of history's most impressive defensive feats. Contemporary military analysis calculates that Belisarius successfully defended approximately 3.8 kilometers of wall per 1,000 soldiers, a density that conventional siege doctrine considered inadequate by a factor of 3 to 4. The battlefield today is covered by modern Rome. The Aurelian walls still stand in many sections, restored and preserved as monuments. Tourists can walk along portions of the ancient fortifications, though they rarely realize they're tracing the exact positions where Byzantine soldiers held off Gothic assaults for over a year. The mausoleum of Hadrian, now called Castel Sant'Angelo, still dominates the western approach to the city center. Its marble statues long since replaced, but its strategic importance unchanged. The Salarian Gate, where Belisarius nearly died, survives. The Milvian Bridge, where the final sortie routed the retreating Goths, still spans the Tiber. These places exist as layers of history: ancient Roman construction, Byzantine defensive modifications, medieval additions, modern preservation, physical evidence of the siege that saved Rome while transforming it forever. In March 537, 5,000 Byzantine soldiers faced a Gothic army that contemporary sources numbered in the tens of thousands. For 1 year and 9 days, they held 19 kilometers of ancient walls through tactical brilliance, engineering innovation, and absolute discipline. The statistics still seem impossible. Modern historians estimate Byzantine casualties for the entire year-long siege at under 100 killed. Gothic losses exceeded 30,000. That's a defensive victory with a casualty ratio approaching 300 to 1. The mathematics of siege warfare suggested Rome should have fallen within months. Instead, it never fell at all. Belisarius proved that numbers don't determine outcomes. Tactics do. His floating mills neutralized the Gothic starvation strategy. His artillery made frontal assaults suicidal. His cavalry sorties prevented the Goths from ever settling into effective blockade. His disciplined garrison transformed ancient walls into an impregnable fortress. But his greatest achievement wasn't military. It was showing that impossible odds mean nothing to those who refuse to accept them. When conventional wisdom says you can't defend 12 miles of walls with 5,000 men, you modify the walls, position artillery, engineer solutions, and defend anyway. When the enemy cuts your water supply, you build floating mills. When they outnumber you 6 to 1, you make every engagement occur on your terms, where their numbers can't be brought to bear. The siege of Rome stands as testament to a fundamental truth. Competent leadership can overcome almost any disadvantage. 5,000 men held off tens of thousands, not through miracles or luck, but through engineering, discipline, and tactical excellence. Every decision Belisarius made was traceable to rational analysis of the situation. Every innovation addressed a specific problem. Every sortie had a calculated objective. History remembers Belisarius as the last of the Romans, and the siege of Rome was his masterpiece. A defense so brilliant that military theorists still study it 15 centuries later, searching for lessons in how to win when victory seems impossible. He didn't just save Rome. He demonstrated that expertise, innovation, and determination can triumph over any odds. A lesson that echoes across the centuries to every commander who has ever faced impossible numbers and refused to surrender. The walls he defended still stand. The legacy he created endures. And the impossible victory he achieved remains one of history's greatest demonstrations that with the right leader, even 5,000 can be enough.